Hi Ved, what's up?
Hello, Priyam. You've been rubbing off onto me. I'm
Really?
trying to
How?
write. It's been a long time, and I've tried to write after a long time. So,
Uh-huh.
yeah,
Yeah, man. It's
hmm,
it's become so difficult to write nowadays. I don't know why, but ever since the lockdown started, I mean, I've always found it difficult to write within a short space of time or write something like that. But ever since the lockdown started, it's become even more difficult. I think partly because of the fact that so many people are writing nowadays. Every time you open a Facebook, well, you don't have to do this, so good for you. You open a Facebook or an Instagram, you see somebody's written something, drawn something, not all of which is quite good, to be honest. Like, it's good for people to have creativity and express their creativity, but I think it's also become compulsive now, with the lockdown. Everybody thinks they have to kind of show their creative side, and it's not great. um yeah, speaking of great though, I mean, this is a very tumultuous time, goes without saying. And I was wondering the other day, how in 20-30 years time we'll look back at this COVID phase and search for emblematic works, whether they are pieces of music or literature or art, and think about what stood out that really represented this. Uh, so, in that context, do you think we have produced something great or can produce something great during this period?
depends, man. I mean, the first question when you told me that there's so much content being created, first question was there is no metric to know what is good or bad, and by extension, there's no metric to know what is great. Like for you, what is greatness?
Hmm. For me, I think, look, firstly, to answer the question of there being no metrics to judge what is good or bad, I don't really buy into that. I think there are definitely metrics to judge what is good or bad. Of course, certain works can be subjective. What you can't always judge is the extent to which something is good or bad, but more or less, for most things in life, you can say whether something is good or bad in a binary, right? Then the extent and that judgment becomes tricky. Speaking about greatness is trickier still, I would say, but I would have, let's say, three criteria to which I would subject any work to if I'm sort of assessing its greatness. And this applies for all kinds of works, right? They can be art, they can be literature, music, even achievements in the sporting realm, which many people sort of condescend towards, but sometimes which are just as impressive. So I think for me, there would be, the first thing would be endurance. For something to be great, it has to transcend time, in some ways defy what Shakespeare calls the tyranny of time, because otherwise it just won't be available for posterity to make sense of, right? So I think it has to endure. Second thing would be the element of personal resonance, and this, of course, depends on what kind of work we are talking about. An artistic work will, of course, have more personal resonance than something that is more mechanical that way, or something that is in the realm of, let's say, a sporting context. But personal resonance is powerful because that is essentially what connects two people when they are like the producer of that particular work and also the audience. Third is perhaps the most difficult to define, but I think it's just something you feel when you're in the presence of a great work. You feel that level of transcendence. It happens to me when I look at a great Messi goal. It happens to me just as profoundly when I read a great poem by John Keats, or I listen to, a great song by Kishore Kumar from the 70s. And I think that has a very difficult terrain to be defined. Like, it's subjective. You define what is transcendent for you, may not be transcendent for me, but more or less these three things.
But then, does that mean there is no standard metric to know what is great or isn't? Right? And you leave it up to your contemporaries or your times to decide whether what you've done is great or not, which is
Hmm.
kind of scary, right? Because there might just be a piece of work which you have created, but it's not giving that feeling of transcendence to people in your contemporary time.
Hmm.
But it might just be great for humanity. It might have been great for posterity. But
Hmm.
then you're caught from both sides there, right? Because if it does not afford that feeling of transcendence to people now, there's no way it's going to, or there's very little chance it's going to evolve and endure for posterity, to whom it might actually end up being of use. So that's a conundrum, right? So I take a different take. I think greatness is more of a function of time in many cases than it is of content itself. Of course, there is a certain threshold you must cross. Right? If you written absolute rubbish, it will not endure. But if you've written something that passes a certain threshold, it is more a function of time whether that ends up becoming great or not, and circumstances far beyond the control of the artist or of people consuming that art or that piece of work. And as because the preservation or the writing of history is probably not in your hands,
Of
but
course.
it's that,
Yeah.
but that's what's going to decide whether it ends up becoming great or not. So
Hmm.
it's more a matter of chance, which is why I think it's, of course, I agree with the personal resonance point, right? I think all great work or all things that appear to be great to somebody do give them a feeling of, say, let's call it temporary euphoria, right?
Yeah.
And I think that itself is personal resonance. It's again, like we've spoken of this so many times, like the theory of the extent itself. It's
Hmm.
the same thing that because I feel good looking at the Messi goal, right? If I'm a footballer, I'm a musician, or whatever I am, right? That idea that there's so much skill or so much talent that's gone behind that score, or there's that moment represents so much in footballing as like or football history, right? That in itself makes me resonate with, say, a moment I look forward to, or a success I imagine, or something I have had in the past, and that's what personal resonance is. That
Hmm.
the creation of the atmosphere around the activity is going to lead to personal resonance more than the activity itself sometimes,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
I think for me, and I think that of course that's also relative. For me, who someone who doesn't understand football that much, right? Maybe a Priyam telling me that, look, wait, this is a great goal, or the crowds rising and like the spectators rising in the stadium and on their seats, and people reporting it as a great goal is what's going to tell me it's a great goal. So
Hmm.
sometimes the atmosphere building around an activity, which again is out of your control, is
Hmm.
far more important than the activity itself. So I think greatness is
Yes.
so much a function of stuff which is not even in the hands of the creator.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I agree. And I think you mentioned atmosphere and apparatus. And a very good example of that is if you compare two works which happened in the first half of the 20th century, both of which are largely prophetic about life in the 21st, but only one of which has really endured in the collective consciousness. The two works that I'm talking about belong to Aldous Huxley, who wrote this novel called The Brave New World. And after that, George Orwell, who wrote more famously now, as is the case, 1984. Now 1984 has endured, and pretty much every single conversation that talks about artificial intelligence somehow mentions 1984, but people don't talk about Brave New World. Like, barely is there a mention of it, and barely is there a mention of Huxley. This is interesting on two counts. Firstly, because at the time these works were written, 1984 barely got any attention, whereas Aldous Huxley was largely revered, and he was one of the first sort of literary celebrities. Now, what has happened with posterity is that Huxley is being kind of airbrushed from history for whatever reason, and Orwell has endured. And this is directly a result of atmosphere, because Orwell's novel is something that is more spectacular. It is something that appeals to, without sort of being disrespectful, to a more superficial level of intelligence. Not to take anything away from Orwell, but the fact that it's more superficially appealing has definitely helped its cause over something like Brave New World, which perhaps doesn't appeal to everybody's tastes. And that is a direct product of atmosphere, of the kind of lives we're living today, where there is shorter attention span, where there is greater demand for spectacle and greater demand for things that are ostensibly outrageous. And at a second level, it's also about apparatus, because the way Orwell has been integrated into the intellectual traditions of the West, into this idea of always being against a grander enemy in form of the state, which is autocratic, which is kind of superimposing, has endured far better than Huxley's idea that, look, you are going to be lured into a state of inactivity, and you're not necessarily going to be punched into it. Like, there is going to be a form of tyranny, but unlike Orwell's model of tyranny, which speaks of pressure from above, there is essentially going to be, in the Huxleyan model, a kind of seduction where you voluntarily surrender all your agency. So I think that's a very good example of how atmosphere and apparatus kind of combine to create greatness. And you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right in that there is very little individual agency. Like, it's very rare for somebody to go out there and say, "Okay, I am going to be great," and for them to be actually proved right.
Fair. So interesting you mentioned 1994, right? In this comparison, you notice how greatness is, or like for Orwell, is also arising of him pandering to or writing about an emotion that's, of course, it's superficial, like you said, but it's far more commonplace. You get it? So it's easier
Mm,
for us to imagine, because so in Orwell's book, the concept of the state, the overarching, like the state surveillance, the way in which they're interfering with individual life, is far more than the Brave New World, where I've heard of it, right? I haven't read Brave New World.
Hmm.
Is where apparently, you will correct me. He's talking more in terms of the pure impacts of artificial intelligence and the rise of intelligence, right? And his is far more centered around the theme, while Orwell also goes into some kind of a sociological dip, where he's talking about AI's effects on how relationship pattern, on how patterns of citizenship, or how patterns of what society is going to look like from the state's point of view is going to change, right? Which
Hmm.
Brave New World apparently doesn't do. It's far easier for us to imagine that, and these come in times where, look at China, look at North Korea, look at the world we're in, right? If I don't want to segue there, but it's far easier for us to imagine it and to believe it. So it's less of a function of what the content in itself was, and more a function of what was believable by contemporary society. Because
Yes.
look, that's around you. So
Hmm.
for all we know, there might come a time where I think he talks somewhere Brave New World talks about reproduction technology, right? If I'm not wrong, that's
Yes.
all I've
Yes.
heard.
Yes.
So in it, I think if we come to a time where something like that or something like transhumanism does become possible,
Hmm.
maybe Brave New World will come back to the
Exactly.
limelight,
Hmm.
right? So again, of course, we've already thrown out there that greatness, you can't know when greatness is going to strike you, even like, perhaps
Hmm.
always posthumously. But I think it's more a function of, if you want to become great, perhaps the one thing you should look at is doing something that can immediately be consumed by the imaginations of contemporary society.
Hmm. Yes, but I think it's become tricky nowadays, right? Because in
Uh,
many ways, the sole metric of greatness or quality has become virality. That the more you produce something that goes viral, the more people listen to it, watch it, experience it, the better it is, because the more exposure you are getting. And that is a huge problem, because that means that very rarely will artistic works, or works of any kind for that matter, that involve a certain level of intellect, will do something that goes against the grain, will do something that contradicts the the zeitgeist, as it were.
yeah,
Because the so much of the focus has been on sort of getting that virality, getting that instant attention. Of course you have exceptions, right? I mean, there are certain cases where works are produced which appeal to both the current masses, as it were, and aesthetically in and of themselves are great works, no doubt about that. There are several cases of that. But I think it's like down to individual creators, and if you look at especially the young people out there, that's kind of become that metric. I've seen so many people, including myself, who've been left kind of crestfallen whenever we, let's say, write a poem and put it up on Facebook, and it just gets like 7 or 8 likes, and we're like, whoa, this is something that is so bad that only 7 or 8
yeah,
people out of 1,000 have liked it, and this has no place in culture. But maybe that's not true. I mean, how many likes would John Keats's poems have got in his days if there were a Facebook back then? Just to imagine. It's a stupid question to ask at many levels, but also it's a pertinent one, because I think what it shows is that nowadays approval or rejection is so instantaneous and so overwhelming that it can stifle that creative expression. It can stifle the act of actually going out there and doing something and creating something for its own sake sometimes, not necessarily for getting the approbation of people around you.
which brings me to it's prompting a new question, right? Is fame important for you to be great? I mean, I'm
Yes,
sure
I
if
think
you
it's a
like,
very good
if
question. Yes. Hmm.
yeah, I think if we just go to the dictionary definition, great does in itself mean like you've got to be distinct or to be remembered,
Hmm.
but or you've got to be distinct. But does it
Yes.
essentially mean you have to be famous? Like, can greatness survive in like the recesses and silences of the world, unknown to
Hmm.
say people beyond your neighbors? Like, you might just be a maestro, and the only people who listen to you is the people who are close enough to your garage where you practice, and the world never
Exactly.
knows.
Exactly. But I think the problem is not so much whether fame and greatness are mutually exclusive or inclusive. The problem is when there is this insistence that fame has to precede greatness, that for something in order, and I think that is becoming even more pronounced in this day and age. Because let's face it, I mean, to a certain extent, it is assumed that nowadays it's far easier to create content than it has ever been, and rightly so, right? We wouldn't have been able to do something like this 5,000
Definitely.
miles apart
Yeah.
even what
Hmm.
3-4 years ago. So obviously content creation is easier, but let's say the fact that we have a limited audience right now, but we produce great content, uh, or we would like to believe that we produce great content.
Great content.
Is that a better scenario in terms of pure aesthetic and intellectual value than, let's say, producing mediocre content for a greater pool of listeners, right? And I think it's a very, very difficult question to answer. It depends on individual ambitions, to be honest. But having said that, I think if something is truly great, and if the apparatus exists for it to be spread, which of course exists today with the internet, then there is no reason why it shouldn't become famous. Like, if you're wanting to be great, there is no reason to go ahead and say, okay, I don't want to be famous because a lot of famous people aren't great, right? And to create that sort of false choice which doesn't essentially exist, while at the same time not having that obsession that, okay, my work has to reach a few thousand people at the very least in order for me to get a sense of validation. So that is important. How do you navigate that tenuous territory between fame and greatness?
Yeah, so I agree that I agree. But I think I would add that in the off chance that you're someone who dies producing music in your garage,
Hmm.
and perhaps you still are great, because we've never really, in fact, if we look at the definition of greatness, we never really define it in terms of who the judge is. So I
Yeah.
think the judgment of great for a judge, like the pronouncement of whether something is great or not,
Hmm.
is the content in itself. And perhaps we'll never know that there's some great stuff out there. Perhaps there's a friend of ours, or like someone you know somewhere who is great in the content they produce and will never be known or never come out. And perhaps we've lost a lot of work like that.
Hmm.
But like some artificial, like some force, supernatural force out there, imagine what you want, fate or God, has pronounced judgment on how great that content is. And should it ever come out, it is great. But
Yeah.
we've been talking about the formation of the atmosphere. In terms of the content in itself, do
Hmm.
you think that, very simple, like people say, there is need for talent, or can practice create greatness, or is
Hmm.
adversity needed to create? These are two separate questions actually.
Yes.
Is
Yes.
is Do you need adversity to produce great content, like in the Rockstar
Hmm.
film? You need to have a breakup to be able to play the guitar.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think it depends on what realm of greatness you're talking about, right? If you're talking about artistic greatness, then I think, yes, you do need not necessarily adversity, but at least some level of conflict. Because unless you experience that level of conflict, it is very difficult to create art that has an element of conflict. And one thing I have realized, and again, I mean, people might disagree with me, fair enough, but I don't think you can produce great art without great conflict, or without conflict at some level. Because if it's all belonging to that same tone, belonging to that same gradient where everything is smooth and nice, after a point in time it loses its value, right? Which is why you look at, like, most of great art is tragic, whether it be music, whether it be, look at the songs, right? The great songs. And I'm a huge Bollywood fan. In terms of Bollywood songs, most of the great songs that I love are sad songs, are melancholic songs. And because they come from a point of view of conflict. Now, as a producer of that kind of content, as an artist, whether you are the lyricist, whether you're the musician, whether you're the singer, can you really appreciate the merit of something that involves conflict if you haven't gone through a certain degree of conflict yourself, right? So I think that's, it's kind of, in my mind at least, I take it for granted that you have to be involved in some level of conflict. And I think most people are, really. I don't think anybody can come out and say, oh, I've had a perfectly smooth life, right? And if they have had, they perhaps don't have any need for greatness. They can just be happy with happiness, as it were, or contentment. But adversity is a different matter. I think adversity not only has conflict, but it also has several other things punched into it, right? And often you can induce conflict, often you can create conflict for yourself, uh, but you can't always generate adversity is more of a product of circumstance, I believe. But having said that, I think if you look at social adversity, I'm not looking at individuals here, but if you look at the periods which have had the greatest turbulence, are invariably the periods that have produced the greatest works, right? So you would have so much of great literature coming out from the world war phases. You look at the Indian nationalist movement, and so much of great works coming during that time, as compared to, let's say, the more, at least the relatively less active 50s or early 60s. So I think it is a function of adversity and crisis or conflict to a great extent.
And so, is it right if I say that there is crisis and there's some kind of turbulence in our life? That's human. Even in like the royal family, perhaps the most calm, tranquil existence possible, there is some kind of petty problem at like daily. Is it fair to say that greatness is basically just drawing great expression out of that tempest? Because the tempest exists anyway. It is your
Hmm.
ability to draw some, like express something wise from it, or something that resonates with other people, or like you said, passes those three checkpoints of transcendence, endurance, and personal resonance.
Hmm.
Maybe just the expression in itself, and not the existence of adversity, because look, that happens to everyone.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I think it's about how you structure complexities, because a great work always has a great structure. It may have different kinds of expressions. So there will be people who will be restrained, like, let's say, like a Keats. There will be people who almost clamoring for your attention, like a Shelley, to sort of take a parallel from a similar period, the Romantic period. So there are differences in style, there are differences in the kind of substance that is being spoken about or written about or whatever. But I think every great work has a great structure. That is, it knows when to introduce a conflict, how to resolve a conflict, or at least the mechanisms for resolving a conflict. And in that structure is located the formula of greatness. Of course, everybody arrives at it in different ways, and there are no sort of direct pathways to greatness, as it were. But I think structure is so fundamental. And this ability, as you said, to express yourself, to take the tensions that is anyway sort of stitched into life, as it were, comes from people's ability to understand structures of expression. And that is evident in everything, right? Let's say you and your friend, let's say both of us, right? Both of us have had a terrible experience. I mean, we can recall some of our debating tournaments in this context, right? And we narrate the story to somebody else, to a third person who wasn't involved. We'll structure it very differently, no, based on our own predilections, based on what we prioritized. We will essentially produce two different stories of the same events. And one of those stories may be more animated, one of those stories may be having a more coherent structure, one of those stories may actually draw the listener in far more than the other. And this will depend on our inherent ability to structure our experience and then express it in a manner that gets the other person involved, you know so I think, yes, structure is perhaps therefore the crucible of expression.
Yeah, and I also think that at some point of time there has to have. I'm sure, like most people disagree. People who I debate this with disagree. There is some kind of inherent, like some kind of innate talent you need to be able to put in that structure in
Hmm.
a way that makes it great. See, I'm sure that in some world, even someone like Gary Minati or Tanmay Bhatt is great, because
Yeah,
there's an audience out there that considers, like, puts them on
definitely.
a pedestal, and there's a halo around. But I still feel that you need to be able to draw out something which is very inherent in you, right? I'm sure there's I also believe in the very utopian idea that there's some kind of inherent talent applicable to this in everybody. It's just
Yeah.
about how you tap into that one way in which you can express this.
Hmm.
But do you believe that? Because you're a sports person, right? So you know that, like,
Yeah,
practice
I'm a
can make
sports
a
person
hell
to
of
the
a
extent
difference.
of following sports. I mean, I'm not particularly good at
Ha.
playing them. But yes, I think it's a false question, in many ways, this whole idea of talent versus hard work that you were hinting at earlier. But before I move on to that, I
Ha.
think I also agree with you that everybody has talent, but I don't think everybody has talent that can be channelized into something that creates greatness. I think a lot of people have talent for very mundane things of life, which unfortunately doesn't get appreciated, but at the same time is very fundamental to everyday procedures. Like, some people are very good at doing administrative work, but you will never find administrative work being celebrated in the portals of greatness. People just calling other people and scheduling meetings, but some people are really talented at that. So I think it's a function of life that some people will invariably get more appreciated than others, simply because their talents are more conducive for appreciation. But the talent hard work thing, I think, is a different matter altogether. So when people, and this is something I've heard loads of times, and it's pathetic. It really sort of annoys me when people say that, oh, Lionel Messi is a product of talent and Cristiano Ronaldo is a product of hard work. Or if you apply that to tennis and say Roger Federer is a product of talent and Rafael Nadal is a product of hard work, it's a very, very stupid thing to say. The reason for that is all these four athletes obviously are incredibly talented. Maybe some are more talented than others. There are things that a Messi or a Federer does that you can't really teach, right? But at the same time, I think we need to change our metrics to understand that hard work itself is a great form of talent. Not everybody can work as relentlessly as a Nadal or a Ronaldo, or so many other people that we know in our daily lives, who put in like hour after hour of practice, and it's productive practice. A lot of people may devote a lot of time. So, I've seen people who just study for hours, but the kind of, let's say, output they're able to gain from that great period of study doesn't really amount for much. But the ability to do something productively and to do that for a sustained period of time is a rare talent, man. I don't see a lot of people having it. So I think it's a false binary that people create, that, oh, you can either be talented or you can be hardworking in terms of proceeding to greatness. One of them has to play a great factor. I don't think that. I think talent, hard work is a form of talent.
No, maybe not the either or, right? But there is one thing you can do. For example, when you said that Messi and Federer do some things differently, some things which you
Hmm.
can't teach.
Yeah.
If you take a bunch of people over a course of time, say if you take 5 or 10 like the greatest of all time footballers over 100 years, 150 years, right?
Hmm.
And you see all of them have produced, like, have something to their claim to fame, and say someone like Ronaldo, who's not doing something you can't teach, but is doing the simple things in the best ways. I don't know if that's
Hmm.
correct, right? But
To a certain extent,
would,
yeah.
would, yeah, but won't it be far easier for Messi to be called great, because in your checkpoints,
Hmm.
it's easier for his something he brought to the world to endure, because
Yeah.
if he's passing in a particular way, or if he scores or moves his like foot in a particular way, and that's something unique to him, generations of footballers are going to be taught that being called the Messi style of doing it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
greatness is easier to come by if there is something innately in you. So I'm not saying that's something you're born with, right? That's something completely different. What I'm saying
Yes.
is there
Hmm.
is a uniqueness you've cultivated. So if hard work is cultivating a uniqueness, maybe that will make you great. But it's important to have that uniqueness cultivated for greatness to come about. Because otherwise there is no endurance. There are a million other people who can train like you. Then again,
Hmm.
it's a product of apparatus and atmosphere.
Hmm. Yes and no to a certain extent. I mean, look, the reason why I think a Messi or a Federer or in cricket a Brian Lara were sort of rated so much higher than their contemporaries was because of the fact that it's a matter of aesthetics, I think, right? That some people can make the ludicrous look very, very easy to do, and which is not possible for what are called the mere mortals. But at the same time, I don't think you can take away anything from the likes of a Nadal or a Ronaldo or let's say Rahul Dravid, who wasn't the most exciting player to watch, but was very, very tenacious at the crease. Now, these people are also doing something that is perhaps not uh, teachable, in the sense that you can't really teach that level of tenacity. It has to come about in individuals through whatever combination of nature and nurture that produces these
Exactly.
things, right? It's just that we don't appreciate it to the same level because they are not immediately noticeable. I mean, it's far easier to appreciate a Brian Lara flick of a ball that falls on off stump and he flicks it to through mid wicket than it is to appreciate a proper Rahul Dravid defense. I'm not saying everybody overlooks that, but very few people actually pay that level of attention. So I think, look, at the end of it all, we have to accede that there are certain kinds of greatness that will always uh, be a part of the
Yeah.
limelight more than the others, will always be noticeable more than the others. But that does not, to at least a purist's discussion or to somebody who's trying to rationally break it down, that does not necessarily qualify as being great, as being greater than something else which is less noticeable.
Okay, so you're saying there's a critic's choice and there's a people's choice, and like both are
Exactly,
great in their own
exactly.
way.
Yes,
Right,
yes,
fair.
yes.
But something you said, I realized, in terms of art, right?
Hmm.
Is it the pattern I'm getting from what we're discussing is it's easier to just make a connection, or not easier, the way in which expression becomes great is if you connect dissimilar things to petty things, or dissimilar things to things that are commonplace and visible to the imagination of the people who are consuming it, and then suddenly it becomes great. What I mean by that is you're talking about state surveillance and you're connecting artificial intelligence to it,
Hmm.
something which people can see. Or say you say administrative work, right, which is what got me thinking. When
Hmm.
I was doing administrative work, like literally things as simple as taking forms about to get permissions for events to be organized in college, was also when I was reading Proudhon, the French philosopher, right?
Hmm.
And that made me realize how similar our work, which we did in our department of college, was to the idea, like to the utopian scholars like Buber and Proudhon and all of these people, right? And how their ideas of cooperative federalism was so similar,
Hmm.
which really sets you thinking that perhaps all that, of course, I don't do anything with it, but perhaps all that the great artists do is they connect mundane things and
Hmm.
to give them a feeling of elevation. There is an something intellectual or something dissimilar connected and infused into their expression of the mundane. I look at PG Woodhouse, right? He
Yes.
literally talks about one scene for pages and pages, and all he does is infuse it with like a wordplay that's amazing.
Hmm. Even
So
even with
you
Oscar
just,
Wilde,
yeah.
like with Oscar Wilde, there is so little action in his plays. Barely nothing happens, but at the same time so much happens because so much is being said, and the dialogue is taken to a whole new level, even though plot or action, barely anything significant happens. And I think you're
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
No, go on, go on, go on.
Yes, I think what you say about sort of combining the mundane and the magical, as it were, and taking something that is otherwise sort of boring and transforming it into something that is interesting, it rests on being able to handle irony. And I think most of what great art is specifically is about irony, because as emotional beings, we are fundamentally trying to reconcile opposites, right? We can feel very angry at certain times, but we have to control our behavior because that's what sort of the modes of society demand. We can feel sort of madly in love with some person at one time and at the same time not confess it because we have like our own idea of esteem or ego to protect. So as human beings, I think we are fundamentally beings of opposites, and in trying to reconcile those opposites, we live a life that ends up being very, very ironic. So anybody who can take that level of irony in art and project the realities of life through those ironies, through those reconciliations between opposite qualities, automatically lends themselves at least closer to being considered great.
I agree. And why I agree with that is because I think it fits in very neatly into your idea of personal resonance. From the
Yes.
not from point of view of from from the point of view of the artist, but from the point of view of the person looking at it or reading it. Because I think the easiest way to go, hey, this is correct, or he feels me,
Hmm.
is when you look at something, you read something, you watch something, and you suddenly realize that this person's expressed what you meant, but in a far more intriguing way. And
Hmm.
of course, that's a very popular concept. The use
Yes.
of irony to the reader is the intrigue. The use of irony to the writer is irony. Right?
Yeah.
But but yeah, I think that's the beginning of the formation of great work, at least in literature or in art, right?
Hmm.
Because it's just the ability to take a very weird cracked lens on what's happening around you.
Okay, great is what I have to say to that. But yeah, just before we end this call,
Yeah.
give me like
Uh,
a sentence on greatness. It can be yours, it
okay.
can be a quote, or just it's a sentence that in
Okay.
your vision
Huh?
is a definition of greatness.
Oh, okay. This is largely disputable, right? But it's because this is what I was writing this morning.
Okay,
Uh, I think greatness is the ability to find wisdom from the petty.
okay, that is very
And
precise.
no, no,
Oh,
no, no.
there's
Let me
more
let
to
me
it.
put let me let me
Okay.
put in a no, no. I want to change a word, right? Just to make it like, let's just put in some kind of
Uh,
rhythm to it, make it sound better. I think greatness is the ability to find profundity from the petty.
so put in some alliteration. Yeah, for greater
Yes.
aesthetics.
No, but
Yes.
I also mean profundity more than wisdom there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I think wisdom again is not something you can necessarily define as easily.
Yes, exactly.
Profundity is easier to get at. Uh, the one I would use, these are not actually
Mm-hmm.
my words, these are words I heard from Stephen Fry, but I haven't heard a better definition of what is great. So I think when you come in
Okay.
contact with greatness, for a moment at least, before you get down like us and sit with metrics and analyze, there's a moment when you feel you're in the presence of sunlit perfection. So you don't analyze it, but you simply bask in its warmth and splendor. And for me, that is greatness, like that which gives you that moment to just bask in it, and then you analyze it, don't analyze it, but you've basked in it and you felt this elevation. For me, that is what counts as greatness.
True. Very true. Can't dispute that.
Okay, so on that note, we'll
Mm,
put an end to this, and
okay.
hopefully we'll have more discussions about, I'm sure greatness will come up somewhere or the other in whatever discussions we have in the time to come as well. ठीक है चलो.
Cool. Chalo. Chalo.
चलो bye.
Bye.
Hi, guys. Thank you for listening to this episode of That's What We Said. We'd really like to know what your definition of greatness is. Who do you think we could have discussed while talking about greatness? And do you really feel that greatness needs to have that element of fame or that element of transcendence that we spoke about? Let us know in the comments section and do subscribe to our podcasts. More episodes coming up. Till then, take care.